In the final year of war, 1944 to 1945, loss rates for German Panzer crews were around 80%. That statistic is staggering when you consider the immense prestige the Panzer divisions held at the start of the war. In 1939 and 1940, the German tank arm was the spearhead of the Blitzkrieg. By 1945, being assigned to a Panzer crew was essentially a death sentence. And this raises a big question. How could a tank that had served as the backbone of the Wehrmacht for nearly the entire war end with such devastating losses? To answer that, we need to go back to the beginning. The Panzer IV didn't start out as a death trap. In fact, quite the opposite. When it was first introduced in 1937, it wasn't meant to fight other tanks at all. German doctrine envisioned it as a support tank. Its job was to carry a short 75mm gun, the KWK-37, and knock out bunkers, machine gun nests, and infantry positions, while lighter Panzer IIIs, with their 37mm guns, handled enemy armour. This division of labour worked fine in Poland and France, where German armour faced relatively weak opposition. But by 1941, the Wehrmacht ran headlong into the Soviet T-34. Suddenly, those short-barreled Panzer IVs were hopelessly outgunned. German crews quickly realised their tank needed an upgrade, and fast. That upgrade came in 1942 with the long 75mm KWK-40 L-43 gun, followed soon after by the even longer L-48. With these, the Panzer IV could finally stand toe-to-toe with T-34s and Shermans at medium ranges. For crews who had once been little more than target practice for Soviet armour, this was a game-changer. By the middle of the war, the Panzer IV wasn't just a support tank anymore. It had become Germany's workhorse, making up the bulk of armoured divisions. While heavier Panthers and Tigers stole the spotlight, they were far fewer in number. It was the Panzer IV that carried the brunt of Germany's armoured warfare across the Eastern Front, North Africa and Western Europe. Of course, firepower is only half the story. The Panzer IV's armour also had to evolve. Early models carried just 20 to 30mm of protection, enough to shrug off small arms fire, but not much else. By 1943, the AUSF-H variant pushed frontal armour up to 80mm. That was a huge improvement, but it was still a game of catch-up. By that point, Allied guns had also gotten stronger. A Soviet 76mm or American 75mm could still punch through at normal combat ranges. And by late war, even stronger weapons like the 85mm, 17-pounder and 76mm HV guns made the Panzer IV dangerously vulnerable. Armour was always a balancing act. Adding more protection made the tank heavier, which strained the suspension and slowed it down. The Panzer IV was never designed to carry that much extra weight, so each upgrade was a compromise. Powered by a 296 horsepower Maybach engine, the Panzer IV could reach about 40 km per hour on roads. That put it roughly on par with the American Sherman, but the Soviet T-34 often had the edge in rough terrain thanks to its wider tracks and better suspension. Still, German crews appreciated the Panzer IV's reliability. Unlike the Panther or Tiger, which often suffered breakdowns, the Panzer IV was relatively dependable in the field. That's part of the reason it stayed in production throughout the entire war. Germany simply couldn't afford to replace it with something more complex. The Panzer IV carried a 5-man crew: commander, gunner, loader, driver, and radio operator/bow machine gunner. That might sound standard, but it was actually a major advantage. In some Allied tanks, commanders were also forced to act as gunners or loaders, splitting their attention. German doctrine emphasized that the commander's sole responsibility was battlefield awareness and directing the crew. In theory, this made German tanks more tactically effective, at least when they were manned by experienced crews. So by 1942 to 43, the Panzer IV had gone from a support tank to a true all-rounder. It had the firepower to take on most Allied armour that could survive at least a few hits, and a crew layout that maximised combat effectiveness. For a time, it was exactly what Germany needed, but the war didn't stand still. By 1944, the Allies were producing tanks in staggering numbers, far more than Germany could ever hope to match. At the same time, new Soviet and Allied designs were rolling off the production lines with better armour and guns. The Panzer IV, once competitive, now found itself increasingly outmatched, and then came 1945. By then, the Panzer IV was still the backbone of German armoured divisions, but it was an ageing design, fighting in a war that had passed it by. Its armor couldn't keep up, its gun was no longer decisive, and Germany itself was running out of resources, fuel, and above all, trained men to crew it. That's where things get really grim. By 1945, the Panzer IV was still on the battlefield, but the war had changed beyond recognition. Germany was fighting on multiple fronts, surrounded by enemies who outnumbered, outgunned, and outproduced them. For Panzer crews, that meant survival rates plummeted to near zero. In fact, by the final months of the war, it's estimated that as many as 80% of Panzer crewmen were killed in action. So why was it so deadly to be inside a German tank in those last months of the war? Let's break it down. The first problem was simple: numbers. The Panzer IV may have been Germany's most produced tank, with about 8,500 units built, but that was nothing compared to the Allies. The United States produced around 49,000 M4 Shermans, and the Soviet Union built nearly 84,000 T-34s of all types by war's end. So, in 1945, while Allied production lines were still churning out new tanks, Germany's factories were bombed, starved of raw materials, and barely functional. On the battlefield, this translated into hopeless odds. A Panzer crew rolling out to face the Soviets in East Prussia or the Americans in the Ardennes could expect to be outnumbered 5-1, sometimes even more. And it wasn't just the number of tanks. The Allies had overwhelming air superiority. German tanks couldn't move in daylight without being spotted and attacked by Allied fighter bombers. Even if a Panzer survived an armoured engagement, it could be picked off by a P-47 Thunderbolt or an IL-2 Sturmovik within hours. The Panzer IV had been formidable in 1942. By 1945, it was hopelessly outclassed. Its 75mm gun could still destroy Shermans and even threaten T-34s at close to medium range. But against newer tanks like the Soviet T-34/85, the American M4A3E8 with the 76mm gun, or especially the British Sherman Firefly armed with the 17-pounder, the Panzer IV was dangerously underpowered. Its armour was also inadequate. Even the late Ausf H, with 80mm of frontal armour, could be penetrated by most Allied guns at combat range. Meanwhile, Soviet 85mm and 122mm guns could destroy a Panzer IV from well beyond where the German crew could hope to fight back. In effect, by 1945, the Panzer IV was a mid-war tank, being forced to fight in a late-war battlefield. Crews knew that almost any hit would be fatal. But perhaps the most decisive factor wasn't the tank itself, it was who was inside it. By the final year of the war, Germany had lost the majority of its experienced tank crews. The veterans who had fought in France, North Africa, and at Kursk were either dead or captured. In their place, the Wehrmacht increasingly sent barely trained teenagers and older men into tanks. This wasn't unique to Panzer crews. By 1945, Germany's manpower crisis was so severe that all branches of the military were filling their ranks with undertrained recruits. The Volkssturm, Germany's national militia, was made up of men as young as 16 and as old as 60, armed with outdated rifles and Panzerfausts. For Panzer crews, this was catastrophic. Tank combat required skill, coordination, and nerves of steel. A veteran crew could survive longer by using cover, maneuvering smartly, and working together under fire. A green crew rushed into combat with only weeks of training stood almost no chance. In other words, it wasn't just the Panzer IV that was obsolete by 1945, it was the crews as well. When we look at casualty statistics for German armoured forces in 1945, they paint a grim picture. Many new Panzer crews lasted only weeks on the battlefield, and in some of the fiercest fighting, their survival could be counted in days. This meant entire units could be wiped out in a single engagement. But we have to remember these weren't just tank versus tank battles. By 1945, every Allied infantry division was saturated with anti-tank weapons. The Soviets had 14,000 anti-tank guns on the Eastern Front, plus countless portable weapons like the PTRD rifle. The Western Allies had the PIAT and bazooka, and both fronts had near-constant artillery fire. A Panzer IV crew could be killed not just by enemy tanks, but by infantry ambushes, artillery barrages, airstrikes, or even mechanical breakdowns that left them stranded in hostile territory. The tank, that had once been the Wehrmacht's most reliable workhorse, had effectively become a death trap. It's also worth noting that the disaster wasn't limited to tankers. By 1945, almost every role in the German army was deadly. Infantry replacements were being sent to the front with only a few days of training. Luftwaffe pilots had so little flight time that many were shot down on their very first missions. Anti-aircraft crews, artillerymen, even supply troops, all were being thrown into hopeless situations with no realistic chance of survival. The collapse of Germany's manpower meant that the entire army was crumbling, and Panzer crews fighting in obsolete tanks against overwhelming odds were hit especially hard. And yet, despite this tragic ending, the Panzer IV remains one of the most iconic tanks of World War II. It fought from the invasion of Poland in 1939 all the way to the fall of Berlin in 1945. It was upgraded, modified, and adapted into countless variants, from tank destroyers like the Jagdpanzer IV to anti-aircraft platforms like the Wirbelwind. Even after the war, Panzer IVs continued to serve in armies as far away as Syria, Romania, and Turkey. For a design that began as a simple infantry support tank, that's an impressive legacy. But for the men who crewed them in 1945, that legacy came at a terrible price. Although the Panzer IV remained the backbone of Germany's armoured forces to the bitter end, for those inside, late war service often felt like riding in a steel coffin. So that's why being a Panzer crewman in 1945 was one of the deadliest jobs in World War II. Outnumbered, outgunned, and often undertrained, these men were thrown into battles they couldn't possibly win. What do you think? Was the Panzer IV a remarkable tank, held back by circumstance, or was it simply outdated and doomed by 1945? Let me know in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to like, subscribe, and check out our other deep dives into the weapons and soldiers of World War II.